Greetings, everybody. Thanks a lot for joining me this evening. As you all know, or at least hopefully you guys know, recently, all I can seem to talk about is the whole sexual harassment issue. And Lord knows it deserves the attention, but it's not the only issue that deserves attention. So I figured I'd switch up my flow a little bit for this evening's interview. I actually wanted to tackle the tax plan that's currently winding its way through Congress. And so I thought I would call on one of my past YouTube interview guests, Adam Millsap, professor of economics and, of course, holder of a PhD in economics from Clemson University. Adam, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Akil.
My pleasure, my pleasure. Last time we spoke, Adam, you were working at the Mercator Center think tank in Arlington, Virginia, but now you are at...
I'm the assistant director of the Hilton Center at Florida State University.
And what does the Hilton Center do exactly?
We do a bunch of research on various topics, tax policy, economic growth, things like that, and then try to get that research into the hands of policymakers who can then use it to make better decisions about economic policy.
Fantastic. See now why I'm reaching out to Adam, folks. There you have it. In a nutshell, what do you make of the current Republican tax plan? We're hearing a lot of controversy about it. What's your take on it?
I think the bills have a lot of good things in them, the Senate bill and the House bill. There's some differences from my understanding about how they treat the number of tax brackets, for example. I think the House bill has like 4 tax brackets, the Senate bill has 7, the tax reform, various small changes on the timings of things. But overall, I think they're both moving in a positive direction along some margins. I think the cutting of the corporate income tax rate, both of them want to move it from its current 35% rate down to 20%. The pace of those cuts varies between the two bills. Some get there, faster, like immediately. Some take years and phase it in. But I think moving that direction is definitely a plus. Simplifying the tax code, so getting rid of some of the deductions, like the state and local income tax deduction or the SALT deduction, where people who itemize their tax returns can deduct taxes that they use to pay their state and local taxes, income taxes, sales taxes, and property taxes. They can deduct that money off their federal taxable income to kind of decrease their tax burden. Getting rid of those kind of things and just simplifying it, I think, are definitely steps in the right direction.
Obviously, the tax plan is pretty controversial. What do you make of some of the charges that are being levied at it, such as the charge that the proposed cuts in corporate taxes actually wouldn't have the job-creating effect that it's claimed that it's supposed to have? Actually, interestingly enough, there was actually a Wall Street Journal CEO forum that was held recently at which the moderator asked the CEOs gathered in the room, how many of you plan to respond to this tax cut if it's enacted by actually spending the savings on job-creating investment? Apparently, only a couple of the CEOs actually raised their hands and said that they would do so.
If the tax reform bill goes through, do you plan to increase your company's investment, capital investment? Just a show of hands, the tax reform goes through.
Why aren't the other hands up?
Why aren't the other hands up? John, I've got a question for Gary quickly.
From what I remember in a CNN report, apparently most of the CEOs would plan to spend those proceeds on more generous dividends for their shareholders, stock buyback proposals, and so on.
When you listen to corporate earnings calls, you guys, you hear these CEOs asked again and again, so if you get a corporate tax cut, if you're allowed to bring in foreign profits back at a very low tax rate, what are you going to do with them? Many of these CEOs say it will be share buybacks and dividends for their investors. There's no guarantee it will go to the middle class.
What recent history shows they've done in the past.
So that awkward moment there with Gary Cohn.
So one of the main criticisms I hear is that this is just a big giveaway to the wealthy. It's not actually going to do anything for ordinary Americans job-wise. What do you make of that charge?
So I have a few different points to make, and I'll try to make them all in order. We'll break it up here a little bit. First, the idea that it won't necessarily lead to more investment. I think we have to look at the kind of CEOs that were in that room. So my understanding is we're probably talking about CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, relatively large companies, not necessarily a representative group of CEOs across the country, mid-sized firms, small firms, things like that, who may respond more to a cut in corporate taxes. So I take all that kind of stuff with a grain of salt when you got a handful of people in a room and they say, oh, they might not do it. That does not stand for all business leaders out there in the the country. And the corporate tax cut will mainly benefit new investment. So large established firms who may not be investing as much or maybe can deal with the rules today as they are, the taxes as they are today, and have their investment plans already laid out, maybe it won't help them as much. But certainly for smaller firms who might want to invest more, expand their plan, expand their operations, they might respond more to the tax cut. So I don't necessarily think that that comment from those CEOs is necessarily indicative of the general response to a tax cut. All the economic research that I read, that I see, is pretty clear that cuts in corporate tax rates, corporate income tax rates, do lead to more investment. And by generating more investment, also lead to higher wages by increasing the amount of capital that workers have to use. That's one of the main ways that you increase productivity over time, increase wages. So I think the evidence is on the side of the fact that cuts in corporate income tax rates will lead to more investment, will lead to more jobs, and will lead to higher wages.
I'm glad you brought up economic research, actually, because this is a perennial question that I in particular have about economics and that I've had for a long time. How much of that research is empirical? Is it research that actually finds that in the real world, regardless of what ought to happen in theory, all other things being equal, based on incentives, is it empirical research that shows this actually has happened in the real world? Because I've heard the contrary stated ad nauseum in the media.
Many of these CEOs say it will be share buybacks and dividends for their investors.
Which is what recent history shows they've done in the past.
Yeah, there's a lot of research and a lot of empirical research that shows this happens actually in the real world. Not necessarily from the U.S., because the U.S. doesn't change their corporate income tax very often, so there's not a lot of chances to see what would happen afterwards. So you usually have to look across countries, various countries, and so look at it. So you have to think about how it might translate across borders, what else is going on with tax policy. It can get complicated, but the theory is very clear. As you said, the economic models, the theoretical models are very clear what should happen. And there's plenty of empirical evidence from across the world that backs this up. Also looking at states too. So looking at the way states change their corporate income tax rates and then what happens across states over time with the U.S. So you have 50 states, different corporate income tax rates, and then you can look and see how the investment changes across the states as well. So there's plenty of empirical evidence that shows that taxes matter, that people respond to incentives. And there's no good reason to think that a cut in the corporate income tax rate today is going to be some kind of anomaly that goes against all this other research that shows that people do respond to incentives and this stuff does matter. And then just real quickly on a side note too about raising wages, you also have to remember the difference between tax incidence, who bears the burdens of the tax, versus who is levied on. The corporate income tax is levied on corporations. That's the idea. The average person thinks that corporations are paying these taxes, but corporations by themselves don't pay taxes. People pay taxes. So you have the shareholders, you have customers through changes in prices based on how the tax affects the corporation, and you have workers. So those three groups bear the burden of the corporate income tax. And a lot of the research shows that between 35 and 60% of the corporate income tax burden is actually borne by workers in the form of lower wages. So even if you didn't think there was going to be any new investment, there would actually be a direct increase in workers' wages through a corporate income tax because they bear a large portion of that burden, anywhere from 35 to 60%. And a lot of the research I see had them more around the 50 to 60% level. So there'd be a direct increase in wages just through that alone.
You know, there's an argument that I actually haven't heard enough, and so I'm glad you shared that with us. By the way, if there are any specific examples of the economic research you're talking about, especially the empirical research, by all means, please feel free to send a few links my way so that I can include it in the description underneath the video so that anyone watching this can see some of it for themselves. There's another aspect of the tax plan that's controversial, maybe not so much ideologically as just in terms of cronyism in a sense, and in terms of influential political lobbies and so on. And of course, I'm referring to the state and local tax deduction, as well as the mortgage interest deduction and things of that nature. I understand you've already published some research when it comes to the state and local tax deduction, SALT as it's known for short. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so the state and local income tax deduction, like I said a little bit previously, it just allows people who itemize their taxes to deduct the money that they use to pay either their state income tax or their state sales tax. If you're in a state like Florida, like I am, there is no state income tax, but you can deduct your state sales taxes instead. Then you can deduct your property taxes, and that's all the states around the country can deduct their property taxes from their federal taxable income. It has an especially big benefit in high tax states and high tax cities where the deduction then means a lot more. If you're in California, California, being able to deduct your state and local income tax means a lot more than if you're in a place like Florida, like I said, with no income tax, only sales tax, but even then the tax burden is relatively low in that state. So you're seeing a lot of pushback from not only Democrats in places like California and New York, where you have these high local and state income taxes, but also from Republicans. So my understanding is that the House bill actually brings back the property tax portion of that and caps it at $10,000 in order to get the House Republicans on board with the tax cut, because they don't want to see their tax burden go up if SALT is eliminated altogether. That's why it's controversial, but in my opinion, it makes the tax code much simpler, not having all these random deductions, just doing a standard deduction. And to be fair, the House bill wants to double the standard deduction. So a lot of people are still going to avoid paying taxes on money used to pay taxes. That's what the problem is. People like the deduction because it prevents them from paying taxes on money used to pay taxes. But if you double the standard deduction, then a lot of people just use that to accomplish the same goal. Like most of us use the standard deduction today. Only 28 to 30% of the country uses SALT. The rest of us just take the standard deduction because we don't itemize. Most of these deductions benefit a very small percentage of the country, and usually it's wealthier people. So if you care about progressivity, if you want the tax code to be more progressive, if you think that rich people should pay a higher burden of the tax, then getting rid of things like SALT and the mortgage interest deduction do just that. They place more of the burden on wealthier people. So in my opinion, progressives, Democrats, people on the left should be all about getting rid of these deductions. And I think a lot of people on the right who worry about taxing the rich too much and things like that should also get behind them because they just make the tax code simpler and fair and help us all understand it better.
Actually, I'm glad you mentioned the mortgage interest deduction in particular, because I've heard it said in the past that there's a consensus among economists, even across certain ideological and political divides that exist in the profession, that the mortgage interest deduction is a bad thing all around, that it produces a lot of perverse incentives in the economy. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head there. So the mortgage interest deduction, for those who aren't clear about it, aren't homeowners, which is a lot of millennials today, right? Well, renters. So for us renters, what you get to do with the mortgage interest deduction, so the money you pay in interest on your mortgage, you can deduct that from your federal taxable income. So none of that interest money can be deducted off, so you don't have to pay taxes on that portion of your income. So homeowners like it. It's one of the big incentives that distorts the choice between renting an apartment versus owning a home, or renting a home for that matter, because you get this extra deduction of the mortgage interest, and you don't get to do that if you're a renter. So it distorts the housing market in the sense that it pushes more people towards home ownership. There's also a bigger problem that's been going on in the sense of zoning. People are really talking about land use reform, and there's a whole idea that there's a really big misallocation of workers across space. So not enough people living in places like San Francisco, New York, DC, and San Diego, high productivity areas, and too many people living in the Midland areas, North Dakota, South Dakota, Ohio, Michigan, whatever. One of the reasons, though, is that those high productivity areas, they use zoning to artificially raise the price of housing and keep people out. One of the reasons they do this is because their house is their biggest investment, their most important investment. So the mortgage interest deduction incentivizes that. It incentivizes people to invest a lot of money into one asset, their home. And then of course they want to protect this asset because they're going to use it for retirement or whatever. And so they put up zoning in order to make sure people don't build other houses that devalue theirs. So in addition to just distorting the choice between renting and buying a home, it also contributes to this perverse misallocation of people across space and incentivizes the use of zoning to keep people out.
I'd actually not heard about the connection between the mortgage interest deduction and zoning before, but that makes sense to me now that I'm hearing it, and that's really, really interesting.
Bill Fischel, who's an economist at Dartmouth, his book, Zoning Rules, he talks about this. He calls it the home voter hypothesis. His idea is just that because homeowners want to protect their assets and they're a pretty powerful constituency in local politics, they can use zoning to do that. So that's where that idea comes from, and there's a lot of evidence that that's what's occurring.
I mean, that sounds like a pretty powerful incentive that they have when it comes to protecting their assets. Like you mentioned, their biggest asset is their homes, and the vast majority of the American people, most of their net worth is tied up in the equity in their homes. So do you actually see much hope long-term for meaningful fundamental reform in that area, given how powerful the incentive is in the other direction?
Absolutely. I mean, it's hard. Even now, my understanding of the bills is all they're doing is cutting it from its current, I think it has $1 million. So if you have a mortgage over $1 million, you can't use the mortgage interest deduction. They want to lower it to $500,000, and they're still getting all this kind of pushback. In San Francisco, every home costs more than $500,000. DC, New York, $500,000 isn't going to get you much. But in most areas of the country, a $500,000 home, you're talking 4,000 or 5,000 square feet, really large house. I mean, only relatively wealthy people are taking advantage of these homes. So again, getting rid of this mortgage interest deduction is a progressive tax cut. It would alleviate this distortion between renting and home owning, and it might help places quit caring so much about their home as an asset and cut down on the land use regulations in order to get more people into these high productivity areas where wages could go up and we could see a big boost in GDP. So despite all its benefits, like you said, this home voter, they're very protective of this benefit. They're very protective of this mortgage interest deduction. And so are the real estate companies and realtors and developers. I mean, they love it too. The people arguing against this deduction are going to be your real estate agents, all those kind of people as well, because it helps them sell homes. They're using that tax deduction is a good incentive for buying a home. So it drives home sales. So, it's going to be hard to get rid of it. There's a lot of constituencies who want it around, and it's such a part of America, the idea of owning a home, and that's the American dream. I think, unfortunately, if we can't even get it down from $1 million to $500,000, it seems hard for me to believe that we're ever going to get it down to where it doesn't exist at all. But I would like to see it done.
Certainly. I definitely sympathize with you, especially when it comes to the zoning issue, because as we've been hearing a lot just this decade, housing prices in major cities are just becoming absurd now. And it's changing even the cultural landscape of these cities, where long-standing communities that are known for having a certain cultural makeup are losing that character in the space of a few years. I used to live in East Harlem in New York City for 3 years while I was going to law school in the first 3 years of this decade. And I used to hang out in central Harlem, and it was still a historically African-American neighborhood. But I read in the New York Times that by then it was already no longer a majority African-American neighborhood. And I'm seeing acquaintances of mine from a lot of these culturally significant areas in cities like New York deserting those neighborhoods and the cities around them in droves and heading for cheaper climates like the South. So it's an important issue. You're seeing affordable housing crises in cities like New York and San Francisco spiraling out of control. You have a lot of concern about this issue from folks on the left, but for whatever reason, they're only very slowly starting to wake up to the role that well-intentioned but ill-conceived government interventions like zoning play in creating that problem and making it worse. So I really do hope that there is meaningful progress in that area. One issue that I do want to tackle before we break is, what about the effect that this tax reform is likely to have on federal government revenue overall? What effect is it likely to have on the federal budget deficit, the national debt, and will the federal government be able to continue to finance its obligations if this tax cut or a package of tax reforms is passed without accompanying spending cuts?
I think you're right on the money there. I think we have to have spending cuts as well. The idea that we can just cut taxes and then push any of the hard decisions on spending cuts off into the future, that's what we've been doing for the last 100 years, at least, and that's not working very well. So at some point, we need to confront the idea that if we want to lower taxes, if people in general just don't want to pay what it costs to run the government at the level that we're running it at now, then we need to decide what we're willing to cut and make those tough decisions. Unfortunately, everybody loves the idea of a tax cut, but then we don't do anything on the other side to cut any of the spending. And running up the deficit, that has bad effects on economic growth as well. We can't just keep running up deficits either. Both of the plans that I've seen, and I'm sure any plan that comes out of Congress, whether it's Democrats in charge or Republicans in charge, is always going to kick the can down the road and not really do any spending cuts. Tax cuts get you votes, spending cuts don't. So unfortunately, I think you're spot on that we do need real spending reform. There's all kinds of low-hanging fruit, farm subsidies, doing stuff with the post office, cutting weekend delivery would save a bunch of money, entitlement reform, raising the retirement age so that we're spending less on Social Security and stuff like that, or strengthening that system. There's all kinds of ways that we can go about trying to make real cuts. You always hear the stories, bridges to nowhere and funding for, looking at some animals' reproductive habits or whatever else on this study. So there's all kinds of crazy things that we could get rid of that would really make a difference. That would allow us to get some tax cuts, cut rates, simplify the tax code, eliminate some of these deductions in a very pro-growth way that wouldn't also then just tack on a bunch of money to the deficit. That's a real concern, and I don't think either one of these tax bills does a very good job of addressing the deficit issues. I think they both need to go back to the drawing board as far as that goes, but I'm hesitant to think that we're going to see any of those big spending cuts that would really make a difference because, again, there's a lot of special interests that care about their jobs. You're not going to cut the whole Department of Agriculture. People care about that job, right? Farmers care about their subsidies. So those things are always going to be tough to deal with, but I definitely think it needs to happen.
That raises, I think, an interesting question. I remember reading in some history books that one slogan Democratic politicians used to like to use was, "Nobody shoots Santa Claus." The idea being everybody likes it when the government gives them what appears to be a free lunch, right?
Yeah.
Like you just said, people like the idea of paying lower tax rates, but they don't like the idea of having the government spend less money on them.
Yeah.
In that case, is it even really worth implementing a package like this if we don't end up getting the spending cuts that ought to accompany it? Is it still worth it?
That's a tough one. I'm not a big macroeconomist, so I can't really speak to the relative benefits of increased deficits versus lower taxes and what that would equal out to. I certainly don't think that you can cut taxes and grow your way. You know, everyone always talks about trickle-down economics or whatever, but that's not really what it is. The idea that tax cuts can pay for themselves in some sense. They can contribute, they can offset some of the deduction in revenue through more growth, but they're not going to pay for themselves. We're not on the wrong side of the quote-unquote Laffer curve. In America, at least, you know, our tax rates are relatively low. No cuts are going to lead to this huge boost in growth that's going to end up paying for itself. We certainly shouldn't try to make that argument. Anyone who does is just not telling the truth. Whether it would be better to go ahead then and raise the deficit by $1.5 trillion over 10 years versus tax cuts today and hope that the deficit doesn't really matter that much when there's short and medium term and that economic growth still continues along, I can't really say. I would definitely like to see them eliminate more deductions, you know, get rid of SALT, get rid of the mortgage interest deduction all the way, cut out some of the corporate tax loopholes and just lower the rate down to like 20%. Do simple stuff and then do some real spending as well. And even if you can't close the gap all the way, even if you raise the deficit over a 10-year time horizon a little bit, try to cut down as much as you can and take a real shot at it rather than this playing around the edges that they like to do instead.
That's right. When I think of government intervention in general, I sort of group most of it, if not all of it, into three main categories. Confiscatory government, when the government takes some of what you earn or own or what have you through taxation and other means. Coercive government, where the government tells you what to do and what not to do. And then you have, for one of a less crude terms, Santa Claus government, where the government gives you goodies. The first two categories are typically politically unpopular. The latter category is usually very politically popular. No one likes to be shaken down or bossed around, but everyone likes a free lunch. That is generally the fundamental challenge going forward. And, you know, it'll be interesting to see how policymakers in Washington ultimately deal with it.
Most big reforms don't happen until a crisis occurs, right? That's when you get big reform. My guess is that as long as the world doesn't care about America's deficit, as long as it doesn't really increase the interest rate on the bonds that we're trying to sell, as long as we always have buyers willing to buy our debt, whether that be China or any other country that's out there, then we'll probably just keep running deficits every year and increasing the debt because we can. And it won't really hit us that we should have done something about it until all of a sudden the interest rate kicks up a couple percentage points, or there's no longer any buyers out there. Everyone starts getting a little nervous about taking on any more of America's debt. That's when we'll have to confront the spending and the revenue problems. Unfortunately, that's when it's also going to be the most painful. It would be nice if we took baby steps to shore up our position, but like you said, just the myopic nature of politicians especially, and voters too, is just not going to get us there, I don't think.
Absolutely. I think you've nailed it. And I just wanted to say very quickly, I do appreciate what you said a couple of comments ago when you acknowledged that tax cuts pay for themselves is a gross overstatement at best. I'm always glad to hear that kind of nuance coming from folks who are nonetheless, you know, pro minimizing taxation and so on, because obviously one of the main calumnies that are hurled at folks who are more free market friendly is, oh, you believe in trickle-down economics. You want to just take care of the wealthy and screw everyone else. And history shows that the wealth doesn't really trickle down. So I'm glad to hear you definitely inject that dose of nuance into the discussion. If there's anything you'd like to say in conclusion, feel free.
In conclusion, I definitely think there's some positive aspects of it. I think lower corporate tax rates would definitely increase wages, both through the direct effect that I mentioned earlier. Also, I think there would be more investment, despite what some of these other CEOs might say. And I think getting rid of some of the deductions, especially the ones that would make the tax code more progressive, the mortgage interest deduction, the SALT deduction, would make the tax code better in the long run. So
great. Thanks a lot, Adam. I really appreciate you once again taking time out of your busy schedule to help educate us economic plebes.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. My pleasure. You have yourself a good night now.
Thank you. You too.
Later.